All right, welcome to another Stopping Socialism video. I'm Donald Kendal, joined as always by Justin Haskins. Joe Biden seems like he has endorsed the Great Reset. At least that's what it seems like to me. If you're not aware about the Great Reset, you got to check out our other videos on the topic. Go to stoppingsocialism.com. You'll find a bunch of articles about the Great Reset. We'll put the latest video that we did on it in the show notes. We'll link to it here. I guess we could just start off by playing the clip of good old Joe.
Play that clip.
Joe.
Yeah, play the clip.
I mean, it speaks for itself, so we'll just jump right into it.
And the days of Amazon paying nothing in federal income tax will be over. Let's make sure their workers have the power and the voice. It's way past time to put an end to the era of shareholder capitalism. The idea, the only responsibility a corporation has is the shareholder. That's simply not true. It's an absolute farce. They have responsibility to their workers, their community, to their country. That is a new or radical notion. These are basic values and principles that help build this nation in the first instance. Now the challenge is to take these fundamental values and apply them to the new economy we have to build in the years ahead. And folks, it's not sufficient to build back. We have to build back better. That's what my plan is, to build back better.
It's the Build Back Better plan. It's the Biden Build Back Better plan.
It's bold, it's practical, and it's focused on building an economy for the future, not for the past. And it responds to 5 truths laid out in this moment of crisis.
Okay, yeah, we don't need to know what it is.
We're not going to do that. We don't want people watching this video committing suicide, so we got to stop it there.
Yeah, so the bold Biden Build Back Better plan.
It's bold.
So there was some language in there, sir, that jumped out to me. 2 different things, actually. The big one is the talking about how we have to get rid of shareholder capitalism. So I actually saw this article like this morning. I was flicking through my phone, and I saw the article talking about him wanting to get rid of shareholder capitalism. And it was just like, oh, there it is. That is Great Reset language right there. But Justin, you could do a much better job explaining it than I can.
Yeah, if you spend a lot of time on the World Economic Forum website, which is a very interesting place, and I understand not everyone can spend their days on the World Economic Forum website, but if you're interested in globalism and you're interested in how sort of the global elites think about the economy, it's a good place to go. And one of the things that you'll find is that the World Economic Forum for a very, very long time has been talking about this thing called shareholder capitalism. They really don't like it. That's how they refer generally to the current capitalistic system that we have.
Yeah, they'll refer to it as profit at all costs, like the predatory capitalism. It's their caricature of what our current system is.
Yeah, exactly. And it often comes up when they're talking about environmentalism is a lot of times you'll see it there, because what they'll say is, these corporations only care about the profits. They only care about answering to shareholders. They don't care about the environment or the planet, and this isn't a sustainable capitalistic system. That's often how it's brought up. So shareholder capitalism really piqued Donnie's interest. It piqued my interest as well as soon as I heard about this, because you don't ever hear anyone talk about shareholder capitalism. Like, when was the last time you just heard anybody, never mind a guy running for president,
right,
talk about shareholder capitalism? That exact phrase is very interesting. And then he connects it immediately to 2 other Great Reset concepts, right? One right after the other. Building a different economy, right? We got to use the COVID-19 crisis to build. That's not, sorry, my phone keeps going off. That's not exactly, he doesn't explicitly say COVID-19, but that's what he's talking about when he says build back better. He's referring to rebuilding our current economy into a better one. And connecting the COVID-19 crisis, connecting shareholder capitalism to that, building a new economy, and then responsibility, having responsibility to your community, having a responsibility to your country, having all of this is Great Reset language.
Right.
It's just he didn't use the words Great Reset or reset, but other than that, all the main talking points are there.
Yeah, I mean, you could see in all the different articles that we have on stoppingsocialism.com about the Great Reset, there's all this language in there about how we can't just go back to the normal. We have to build a new economy. It's got to be this new era of capitalism, right? So that's what caught my attention when he was talking about, we have to build it back better. Not the same, not going back to how it was, but building it back better. But so the one of the reoccurring things with all of the talk about the Great Reset is, again, going away from shareholder capitalism and towards stakeholder capitalism, which is all of that kind of what you were just talking there with you have a responsibility to the community, you have a responsibility to the planet and the country. And it's basically trying to look at companies. Again, you could do a better job of explaining it than me. But in terms of successful countries, looking at something more than profit, it's how they treat their workers, how they deal with the environment. And it's kind of gets into the weeds a little bit, but it is kind of core to this idea of what the Great Reset is.
Yeah. So one of the key ideas of there's this whole left-wing movement, far left-wing movement, that wants to change the way we think about corporations and businesses and how you evaluate corporations and businesses. And really, we should do a video devoted entirely to that topic because it's a really interesting, important topic. But
Sure.
What I think you need to know, generally speaking, is that the old socialist way of doing things in the past, the far left, socialist, even really hardcore progressive groups, the way that they typically did manage the economy was by confiscating property. So historically speaking, socialism, when in whatever form you're talking about, whether it's one industry or a whole economy or a full-blown Marxist communism, the core essential idea is collective ownership and management of property. In order to manage the property, you have to collectively own the property. Now, over time, what a lot of left-leaning governments started doing is they realized that they couldn't just confiscate property because that's what communist governments were doing all over the world. And they were murdering people and it was causing all sorts of problems, right?
Failing horribly at it.
Right. That's what we think of when we think of the Soviet Union and all of these other failed Chinese communist state, all of that kind of stuff, right? We think of them confiscating property and then trying to manage it. So what a lot of European and American progressives and socialists started calling for was, well, let's just use regulations and that kind of thing to really push the economy in one direction or another. And then we could create these big social welfare programs, and they kind of moved in that direction. Well, this kind of builds off of that. It's in addition to those big giant welfare programs, in addition to lots of regulations and high taxes, they add on top of that, let's completely reevaluate the way that we think about companies. And instead of just saying how much evaluating companies based on profit, we instead evaluate companies based on whether they're good global citizens, whether they treat their employees well, which could mean anything, according to the left, whether how inclusive are they? How many minorities do they have working for them? How much land do they consume in their processes? What's the air quality in their global supply chain? We've seen all kinds of really weird, ultra specific, some very broad, but it's the whole idea is let's evaluate companies with measures that are not based on profit. Let's look at other social ways of evaluating companies.
Right. And that might seem like, oh, yeah, I can get behind that. But if you really look into it, it's basically changing the system from a system where, a company could count how successful it is because of the individuals that are actually purchasing services or products from that company, right? That's profit right there. And changing it to a system where we're judging how successful a company is based on these kind of like random collective goals, right? So it's away from the individual and towards this collective idea where these metrics could be changed by whoever's establishing them in the first place at a whim. So
Right.
it's a shift from the individuals controlling the economy to this collective idea.
Right. And so tying this back to what Joe Biden was saying, when he's talking about shareholder capitalism, it's interesting because the left, when they talk about shareholder capitalism, what Joe Biden is talking about here is they're saying, whoa, wait a minute. You know, these companies they're not thinking about their communities. They're not thinking about their countries. They're only thinking about what the shareholders want. What's really apparently missing from that is, what about the customer, right?
Yeah.
The customer is not a shareholder necessarily. It
Right.
typically isn't. The customer is really who they're all interested in. The shareholders, the management of the company, everybody is interested in what the customer wants, right? And so what this also does is it throws the customer out the window too. The customer doesn't even matter that much to us. It's not about what the marketplace wants, what the customer wants. It's not about what the shareholder wants. Those are the owners, the shareholders. It's not about the management of the company. None of those people really matter that much. The people who matter the most are everybody else, the collective. That's who matters.
Right.
And of course, who is the collective? What does the collective want? That ends up often being decided by some elite group of bureaucrats that gets selected by the collective indirectly through these elections and all this other stuff, right? So that ends up becoming the system. The system ends up being the collective management of property through these bureaucratic structures and everything else, on top of the welfare programs, on top of the taxes, on top of all the other left-wing stuff that we have, the regulations and everything else. You end up with companies now being bribed through government grants and other things into looking at collectivism and collective principles instead of looking at what customers want, what shareholders want, what the management of the company thinks is best for the company. It completely distorts what capitalism actually is, where, you know, it's supposed to be based on markets and
Right.
supposed to be based on demand and all. None of that matters. What matters now is it good for the planet? Is it good for what we think is good for the collective? Those are the things that matter. And so they refer to this as stakeholder capitalism. They call it a form of capitalism when in reality, I think that this is socialism. This is a brand of crony socialism, okay, where you're using your power in government to manipulate and control companies to do what is in the interests of the collective, okay? So it's collective management of property without having the ownership of property. They'll say it's capitalism because they don't want, you know, to have that dirty label of socialism. Because as soon as the World Economic Forum is promoting socialism, they lose all credibility, right? But if they can have some brand new, interesting form of capitalism to promote, well, then people might actually listen to them. So that's really, I think, where the future of socialism is headed. It's not through just let's confiscate all of the property. There's some of that will happen, but that's not the primary way that you're going to get socialism. You're going to get it through all these other means. And when you tie this to funding, which is really the key thing to understand, it's not just about, well, we're going to judge companies. We've been talking a lot about that. Well, they're going to judge companies based on all these social metrics, right? Instead of just profit. But that on its own is really not that big of a deal. But when you start tying government funding to how people perform on those metrics, well, now that's where you've got the real control, right? So when you tie the government funding to it, and then you throw modern monetary theory into the mix, where now the government just prints as much money as it wants, well, now you have the people who control the money, control the economic activity, because they decide what companies will do and how will they decide it, not based on market efficiency, not based on profit, not based on what customers want, but based on these collective social goals that are established by some bureaucrat that's elected indirectly through the collective. So it's a really indirect, roundabout way, complicated way of having socialism without calling it socialism.
Yeah. So we've been kind of covering the different pieces of this throughout our project, the Stopping Socialism project, and it's all starting to come together now. And I think we're really starting to piece these things together and see the vision of what a 21st century socialism state will look like. And Joe Biden saying this, talking about having to get rid of shareholder capitalism, talking about building back better. To me, when I heard this, when I saw this morning, I was like, well, there it is. There it is. But was that not enough for you, Justin? I mean, I think that this is him basically endorsing the concepts of the Great Reset without directly saying it.
So I think it might be. There are a few differences between some of the stuff that Biden said in the rest of this speech and what you normally think of as Great Reset language. Normally, when you hear about Great Reset language, there's a lot of rebalancing economies globally, whereas Biden's position was pretty, focused on America and making America more competitive with other countries, and it was very focused on America, which would be a pretty big difference because the Great Reset crowd is interested more globally.
Sure.
I would say that the other thing is, of course, he didn't use the magic words Great Reset or reset, which a lot of these other people on the left have used. Head of the United Nations has called for a Great Reset. We already talked about the World Economic Forum, the International Monetary Fund, presidents and CEO of major corporations like Microsoft, BP, MasterCard, bankers from all sorts of different major multinational banks, Bank of China, tons and tons of different people, Greenpeace, you name it, are using Al Gore, John Kerry, using the actual words Great Reset. Okay. So we know that they're all in bed with each other because they all know each other and they're using the exact same slogan and phrase, right? So, and when they get into the details, they're saying the same sort of thing. This is him saying it without actually using the words Great Reset, which is interesting. And I do wonder if at some point we'll see him actually use those words, and or if he'll always just kind of stick to the concepts, but then wrap himself in the American flag while he's doing it. So it doesn't seem like this globalist, thing being pushed by the World Economic Forum and United Nations. And it's really just this, FDR kind of I love America sort of
Yeah,
way.
no, see, I think there's two other things going on here. One, like John Kerry and Al Gore, when they mentioned these terms, they were talking in front of a more global audience. Joe Biden, this is a speech that he's giving in like Pennsylvania.
Correct.
Right. So he's obviously just trying to appeal to like the common voter. And then also the Build Back Better. I'm sorry, that's a terrible plan. The Build Back Better plan. I think that's just it, but with the Joe Biden label on it. Right. It's the same thing. It's a Great Reset. It's just like it's his plan. So it doesn't look like he's just totally biting it from some, a globalist organization. They're just going to call it this. So I think that he'll never actually say those words. It'll always be painted in this Joe Biden paint of Build Back Better. But I think it's it. And the fact that he said shareholder capitalism is enough proof for me.
Yeah, the shareholder capitalism thing it's hard to argue against that because it's such a weird thing to say if it's just a coincidence.
Right.
Like the odds of this just being a coincidence that he would use that phrase in connection with all these other concepts that we're hearing from them seems almost inconceivable. I will say this. It's entirely possible, though, that this isn't actually coming from Joe Biden because Joe Biden...
Yeah, I think that's irrelevant. Yeah, he's not writing the script, sure.
Yeah, he's not writing the script. And that begs a lot of questions, too, just about Joe Biden in general. I mean, how much of Joe Biden's platform is from Joe Biden and how much of it is from other people? And I don't just mean that because he's compromised himself, sold his soul for, this election, which I think he definitely has, because he used to be he was never moderate. That was a lie that he was moderate, but he was moderate compared to the crazy left-wing socialists and far left-wing progressives that the party is, now being run by. Mm-hmm. He was definitely more moderate than them. And he's become almost indistinguishable between a far left progressive. He's not quite a socialist, but he's as far to the left as you can go without becoming a socialist. And, he's moved very far in that direction, and he has sold himself out a little bit. But in addition to that, there's all these issues with him and just his cognitive function and how there is Joe Biden.
Oh,
I
sure.
mean, I hate it. Look, Democrats did this to Ronald Reagan. Okay. This is before our time, but toward the end of Ronald Reagan's time, there was all sorts of things about Ronald Reagan being too old and Ronald Reagan losing it mentally and all of that. The left absolutely did that. And of course, I think there probably was way over exaggerated. And so I'm not saying this though, just for partisan political purposes. I mean, if you watch speech after speech after speech of Joe Biden, it's hard to argue that he is as there as he was, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago even. It's really hard to make that argument. And I'm willing to bet that you could, if a fair-minded person were to watch enough Joe Biden clips, they would come to the conclusion that, yeah, you know what? He's probably not all there anymore. I mean, that doesn't mean he's mentally incapacitated, but he's clearly not up to where he was before. I mean, clearly. And so how much of his agenda is now compromised for that reason too? How much of this is him just saying, I'm tired and I just want to win and I don't care anymore. Just give me the speech. Just put it in the teleprompter and I'll read it. Like how much of that is happening? I don't know.
Well, I again, like this was just a kind of a shocking thing to wake up to when I saw this speech.
Yeah.
So I know that we're going to obviously pay close attention to him and all the other things that he has to say, and to see if he uses some of this language that's kind of in the whole Great Reset conversation, or continue to say these things. Obviously we'll report on it.
There's one more thing too that I want to add before we end this. I think one of the interesting things about this is that there were a number, I don't know if you saw it this way, but I first saw it this way through it wasn't even a conservative outlet. It was like liberal outlet that was covering that he said this. It was like CNBC or something like that. And there were several liberal outlets that covered that Joe Biden said this thing about shareholder capitalism, which I thought was really, really interesting. Why would the left focus in on that issue? Unless it's part of some sort of larger campaign to smear the concept of shareholder capitalism, because this is not a State of the Union or a convention speech or something like that. This is just some random speech in Pennsylvania that this guy's giving. Right. This is 13 minutes in to a 30-minute speech on the campaign trail. He gives a million of these speeches. Over the past 6 months, he's given literally hundreds of these things, right? So why this? Why do they write articles about this comment? In some ways, I look at it and I'm like, that can't be a coincidence either. Like, they took this 30-minute speech and what did they hone in on? They honed in on shareholder capitalism too. That's strange, I think. I mean, there's a lot about this that's strange. The use of shareholder capitalism, the fact that the media has covered it. I don't really understand that. There are more liberal outlets covering shareholder capitalism, him talking about that, at least that I saw this morning, than there were conservative outlets covering it. Why? Why would that be?
Yeah, it's maybe we're starting to see the attempt to really inject this term into like the public lexicon, right? Like, this brand of capitalism is bad. It's harder for them to sell socialism, but if they can like demonize what we're doing as some subset of capitalism that's bad, then maybe it's easier for them to sell what their brand of stakeholder capitalism, still capitalism, and how it's better. So maybe we're at like the forefront of them trying to inject a new word into the public lexicon.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that very well could be the case. And I guess we'll see as time goes by how much attention they give to this.
And we'll know the origins of it too. It wasn't Joe Biden. It's a World Economic Forum and these group of globalists that are going to be meeting in Davos next year.
Yes.
All right. Well, obviously, we'll continue to follow Joe Biden as he talks about this stuff and the Great Reset. It's probably the most important topic going on right now. So check it out. We've been covering it extensively. StoppingSocialism.com. You can find us on Facebook. Just look up Stopping Socialism. Find more videos like this on our YouTube page, Stopping Socialism TV. We also have an Instagram page and a Parler account if you don't want to follow. You don't want to be on Twitter anymore because it's a terrible cesspool. Justin, where can they find you on Twitter?
I don't like that. I don't like the lead up to that. I don't like that. They can find me on Twitter at Justin T. Haskins.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll talk to you later.